with Dr. Tricia Mulligan, chair of the Political Science Department. So on October 1st, Congress missed their deadline of coming up with a spending plan for the new fiscal year,
yes,
which resulted in a government shutdown. So can you explain the significance of a government shutdown?
Sure. So what generally happens with the government shutdown is that programs that typically receive federal funding are no longer receiving that. And it doesn't mean a total shutdown all at once. It means initially that non-critical programs, things like maybe a Head Start program or museums, federal museums that are national parks, lose funding first. A lot of agencies will have a reserve that they can keep afloat for maybe a week or two for essential employees. But if you get beyond the second, third week, then those reserves begin to dry up. So what ends up happening for real people is that you have government furloughs, people having forced days off for which they will not be paid. I mentioned the Head Start programs not working, so children aren't able to attend. That creates problems for people being able to go to work because they have no one to watch their children. And then you have other issues with tracking of the Center for Disease Control, for example, tracks flu outbreak. Their statisticians are part of the shutdown, so they're not able to do that. Same thing with employment numbers. So anything along those lines would be a pretty significant problem for the United States.
So how does this affect the average American person and the economy?
Well, I think in the short term, it's the people who work directly for the government that are most directly affected. So, if you're on furlough, you're not being paid, then obviously that will have repercussions down the road. If you have a vacation scheduled to, Washington D.C. and expect to see the museums, that's going to be a problem. I think that this is not the first time that this has happened. It's the 14th or 15th. In 1995, 1996, you had shutdowns that went for just about a month. And so I think what the danger is, the longer this goes on, the more people you have not working. It can have a repressive effect on the economy, which is arguably turning around. People aren't spending, people get concerned, particularly getting closer to the holidays. But I think generally, on a day-to-day basis, the people that are work for the government that are first affected. The rest of us, we have some insulation for a little while.
So short term, not much of a noticeable impact.
Exactly.
Long term, how time frame, a couple weeks?
I think if you go much beyond a month, then you have critical services. If you have the Veterans Administration that's not which has a backlog already that aren't able to administer benefits, or you have student aid that's being paid out, will there be a problem? If you have grant submissions to the National Health Institute of Health, those things can't be processed, and so people can't get grants, and they're scientists. That means they can't conduct research. That means there's a trickle down effect, basically economically, but also in terms of scientific knowledge, etc. So I think the effects are very varied in scope. I would be surprised if we go beyond that window. I think at this point, the Republican leadership, John Boehner, has said that we will not be so irresponsible as to let this go on indefinitely, whatever that means. You have Republicans in the Senate and also governors, Jeb Bush, the governor of Tennessee, who are Republicans, saying, you few Tea Party activists like Ted Cruz, et cetera, enough. It's time to compromise, move forward, and move beyond this recent crisis.
Talk about how Obamacare influenced the House Republicans' decision on the government shutdown.
All right. So for the House Republicans, they put sort of a line in the sand saying that we will not renew the budget unless there's a 1-year stay placed on Obamacare, basically that it wouldn't be funded for a year. And the reason many argue that this was done was because they're not very happy about Obamacare. They weren't happy about Obamacare when it was initially passed, and so this is an effort to derail that, because without funding, obviously, the program cannot succeed. And that was, a small group of Republicans. Now, what's kind of come out since then is that people who voted for a procedural vote within the House were categorized as supporting this stay on Obamacare, which is not the case. And there have been a number of Republicans that have come out and very angry about that. So I think while Obamacare is sort of the critical juncture, sort of the final straw, if you will, a lot of the dissent, the lack of compromise, I think stems from the disunity that's present in the Republican Party right now.
So what are some of the objections to Obamacare?
Well, I think some people are concerned that it's an infringement on an individual freedom, that why should you be forced to purchase health insurance of any sort. I think they overlook, the exemptions that are in place for people that are lower income, because they'll make the argument, well, if people can't afford it, they shouldn't be forced to. But we do have other kinds of insurance that are obligatory. I mean, Obamacare is not alone. Car insurance, if you drive a car, you're expected to have car insurance, right? So I think that there's an ideological objection. I think there's a concern about how much the program will cost. I think that those conversations often happen at cross purposes. There'll be a discussion about how much it will cost, how much we'll be saving, and the gray area in between is not something that's often explored by extremes on both parties. So the truth is probably in the middle. The tracking that's happened at the state level since the program went live October 1st, websites, the Connecticut website, for example, for the exchange is getting like 82,000 hits, and they've already had 1,000 individuals sign up. Now, whether that means it's a screaming or roaring success, I think it's kind of early to tell, but it does show that people are taking advantage of this, and there is some support. But I don't think it's just about Obamacare. I think that's part of a larger problem.
Polls show that Americans are not in favor of the House Republicans. They feel that they are to blame for the government shutdown.
Right.
What can the House do in the future to get back on the popularity of the American people?
Well, that's a tough question. I think polls over the last couple months, and actually within the last 2 weeks, have shown that the Tea Party faction of the party, the Republican Party specifically, is at its lowest popularity rating since 2008, which I think is in response to some of the lack of compromise that's been going on, not just for the last month, but for the last year or more. I think people are also super critical of Congress. Congress's approval rating is somewhere around 10% right now, which is abysmal. And so I think to blame one group is probably inaccurate. I mean, there's lots of blame, if you will, to go around. But I think that the fact that the party is turning on a faction of their own party is telling. And Jeb Bush made a remark yesterday that was reported in today's news that, you people in Washington, referring to this, small group of Republicans in the House, are derailing our efforts to rejuvenate the party. And I think that's really telling. When you begin to have so many important, influential members of the party, likely presidential contenders as well for the next election, speaking out, it's going to put their position in jeopardy. I mean, the House will be up for re-election next year, and I think that if they don't lose this label of being unwilling to compromise, that in their minds it's more important to be right than to get something done, they're probably going to have a very difficult time come next November.
Well, thank you very much for meeting with me today.
You're welcome, Kyle.